We've heard as well from Charles Michel. We will hear from Joe Biden, the U.S. president, with the promise of the toughest and most focused and targeted sanctions that we have yet seen. Of the measures that are being discussed at this point, there have already been some banks, there have already been some Russian oligarchs and individuals, but what are the tools available now that would be that strong, sharp response from a sanction point of view that you just called for?
Well, Germany already has said that the pipeline project Nord Stream 2 is now suspended, and while technically it is just a refusal to continue the certification project process, I think we can assume at this point that the pipeline is dead in the ground and will never be filled with gas. End of, full stop. The sanctions package, I think, at this point will come out at the uppermost echelon of what allies have been planning together for months. My sense from what I've been reading is that there is still some dispute as to whether to include Russian access to SWIFT, the financial messaging service for banks at this point, or to leave some room for escalation. There's probably legitimate arguments to do one or the other, frankly.
Okay, let me just jump in. As you said, SWIFT is a financial system. It shuffles money from bank to bank around the world, and that would be considered one of the toughest financial steps that countries and organizations could take. Along that line, financially, there's some discussion about whether one measure should be to deny Russia even access to the US dollar. Is that part of what you'd consider?
Look, I'm probably not the best person to ask about this kind of thing. I'm not a sanctions expert, but I will say this. I think it's also important to understand that Russia will be diplomatically a pariah on the scale of North Korea after this. And my final point is that this has huge implications for NATO's planning and force posture. This is the end of the NATO-Russia Act, presumably, which was an attempt to build a bridge of communication and trust building with Russia after 1997. And I think we will see the NATO response force, the VJTF, called out. And because with the end of the NATO-Russia Act, I think we will also see permanent forward basing of NATO forces on NATO's eastern flank. And as far as I'm concerned, that is a very good thing indeed.
Well, indeed, we were listening live, Constance, to Secretary General Stoltenberg as he announced that very fact that the defense plan, the NATO response force, is one of the things that they're looking at ahead of a NATO summit tomorrow. And he was very clear, again, with Ukraine not a NATO member, NATO will not fight for Ukraine, but also made repeated references to the concern about this spilling over into NATO nations and how important it is to be avoiding any missteps, any miscalculation, any misinformation. What exactly do you think NATO should be doing in response at this point?
So, Heather, that's an incredibly important point, one of that I've been making for a very long time. I have had people telling me, because Ukraine is not a member of NATO, Article 5 doesn't apply, and so, as it were, the West could cordon itself off from the risks of conflict in Ukraine. That assessment couldn't be more erroneous. I think there is a huge risk of a military, political, economic spillover. In fact, we're already seeing this spillover in terms of the markets tanking and the gas price spiking. But it is entirely possible that you could see, shall we say, this is just speculative, but it's not impossible. Russian forces pursuing Ukrainian forces, NATO member states letting them in, and then making a unilateral decision to protect them militarily. You can imagine what I'm getting at here. It is absolutely.
And if anyone is wondering why we're focusing, why this is such an important flashpoint, it is because of those sweeping potential consequences.
Yes, exactly. So I think there are two things need to happen here, I think, now. I think Western leaders need to be on. I think for too long a time that has not happened. And I think we need to understand that we're all Ukrainians now, literally. and that what is happening in Ukraine is a business. And if we don't stand up for Ukraine, we won't be standing up for ourselves. Apart from that point of principle, I think we also need to understand that we are looking at potentially massive humanitarian crises on the ground, with a need for the protection of Ukrainian civilians by international organizations such as the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the International Red Cross. That humanitarian aid might need military protection. That in turn will require Western leaders having very firm words with Russians and so on. There's a lot we are going to be having to do a lot at the same time. And again, it's about us. It's about Ukraine.
Constance, I cannot thank you enough for your depth and for your thoughtfulness. It's given us a lot to mull over as we watch these early hours. And thank you very much. I look forward to your returning to the program as we continue to follow this. Constance Stenson-Müller, she's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, the Fritz Stern Chair in Washington, D.C.
Serve people as quickly as possible. Today we are
Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. We are urgently issuing travel documents for people everywhere who care about freedom and democracy. And while the eyes of the world are on leaders, innocent people are now facing violence and chaos. In these dark hours, Canada's message to the people of Ukraine is this: you are not alone. We are standing with you. Canadians and permanent residents in Ukraine, your safety and security are now our top priority. We also want to make sure that you can get to safety. We've arranged for safe passage for you and your families at the land borders with Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Moldova. We are urgently issuing travel documents for affected Canadians, permanent residents, and their immediate family members. We're also prioritizing immigration applications for Ukrainians who want to come to Canada. And to ensure we can serve people as quickly as possible, today we are launching a new dedicated phone line for anyone at home or abroad with urgent Ukraine-related immigration questions. Aux Canadiens et aux résidents
to
permanents du
Canadians
Canada,
and permanent residents in Ukraine.
votre santé
Your
et
safety and security are our top priority.
On a pris des mesures
We
pour
also
que vous
want
et
to
votre
make
famille
sure
puissiez
you
traverser en
can
toute
get to
sécurité
safety.
les
We have
frontières avec la
arranged for
Pologne,
safe
la
passage for
Slovaquie,
you
la
and your
Hongrie, la
families
Roumanie,
at the
la
land borders of
Moldavie.
Poland,
Vous
Slovakia,
délivre de
Hungary,
toute
Romania,
urgence
and
des documents de
Moldova.
voyage aux
We are
Canadiens
urgently
et aux
issuing
résidents
travel
permanents touchés,
documents for
ainsi
affected
qu'aux membres de
Canadians,
leur famille
permanent
immédiate.
residents, and their immediate
On
family
traite aussi
members.
en priorité
We are also prioritizing immigration applications for Ukrainians who want to come to
Et pour être
Canada.
certain de pouvoir servir
And
les
to
gens le
ensure
plus
that we can
rapidement
serve people
possible,
as quickly
on
as
lance
possible,
aujourd'hui
today we are launching a new dedicated
téléphonique
phone line for anyone at home or abroad with urgent Ukraine-related immigration questions.
questions.